doesn't take landfall to create destruction. That's a National Weather Service meteorologist in Honolulu explaining why a storm that technically never touched Hawaiian soil still knocked out power to 70% of the Big Island and took a life this weekend. Here's the number I want you watching by the end of this video, and it's not the wind speed or the rainfall total. It's a distance, in miles, because that single figure explains something about hurricane danger that most people completely misunderstand. Let's walk through exactly what happened, because if you watched our earlier coverage of this storm, this is the update you've been waiting for. Hurricane Lala strengthened into a Category 1 hurricane Saturday afternoon, with sustained winds reaching 80 miles an hour. At its closest approach around 5 p.m. Hawaii time Saturday, the storm's eye wall brushed the southern tip of the Big Island, from roughly 30 miles offshore. The center of the storm never crossed onto land. Meteorologists were direct about that specific point. Landfall did not occur. Here's the honest, immediate human toll. Hawaii Governor Josh Green confirmed that one person did not survive a storm-related car accident near South Point, the southernmost tip of the Big Island. 2 homes were swept away by flash flooding in Naalehu. Hawaii County's mayor said several occupied homes may have been knocked off their foundations, and search and rescue teams were actively working overnight. More than 126,000 customers lost power across the islands, nearly 70% of the entire Big Island. More than 190 flights in and out of Hawaii were postponed. Rainfall in the highest elevations of the Big Island exceeded 30 inches in some spots. Wind gusts reached 80 miles an hour on the ground, with hurricane-force gusts reported across Hawaii, Honolulu, and Maui counties simultaneously, as mountainous terrain amplified wind speeds at higher elevations. Governor Green said he has already started the process that leads to a major disaster declaration. Here's exactly why officials keep emphasizing that the storm's center never technically made landfall, because it matters for how you should actually understand what just happened. A hurricane's most violent winds and heaviest rain aren't concentrated at a single point, the eye. They're spread across the eye wall, the ring of thunderstorms surrounding it, which can extend outward for dozens of miles. When that eye wall brushes a coastline from 30 miles out, the communities on that coastline still take a direct hit from the storm's most dangerous winds and rain, even though the technical center of circulation never crosses onto land. It's worth naming exactly which communities took the hardest hit, because the National Weather Service's own warnings were specific rather than a vague, island-wide alert. The flash flood emergency covered Naalehu, Pahala, and Hawaiian Ocean View, all in the Kau District, the southernmost stretch of the Big Island, and the closest populated area to the storm's actual track. Hawaii County officials specifically noted that the peak impacts arrived Saturday afternoon and evening, as the hurricane was passing roughly 35 miles south-southeast of South Point at 3 p.m. before making its closest approach 2 hours later. It's worth understanding the earthquake detail that made headlines alongside this storm too, since it's a genuinely unusual coincidence worth mentioning. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, at least 5 earthquakes were reported in the region during roughly the same 12-hour window, the strongest registering magnitude 3.7. These earthquakes were relatively minor and posed essentially no threat compared to the hurricane itself, but the timing offered a rare, genuinely striking example of 2 of nature's most powerful forces, seismic and atmospheric, playing out in the same place within the same day. It's also worth understanding the economic dimension of a storm like this one, beyond the immediate human and infrastructure toll. Hawaii's economy leans heavily on tourism, and a hurricane threat that cancels flights, closes beaches, and forces visitors to shelter in place for days carries real financial consequences beyond the direct storm damage itself. With more than 190 flights postponed in major tourist areas across the Big Island, under evacuation and shelter guidance, the ripple effects for hotels, tour operators, and small businesses will likely extend well beyond the storm's actual physical footprint, a genuine secondary cost that tends to get less attention than power outage numbers or rainfall totals. It's worth understanding what ranchers and agricultural operations across the Big Island actually had to do to prepare for this storm, since the guidance they received was genuinely specific to the island's unique terrain and industry. County officials urged ranchers to leave cattle in open pastures rather than moving them into structures that might collapse under hurricane-force winds. A piece of guidance that sounds counterintuitive until you understand that a modern barn or shed can become a genuine hazard if its roof or walls fail. That same logic extends to why officials specifically avoided ordering evacuations off the island entirely, since Hawaii's status as an island chain means the emergency shelter options residents can actually rely on look fundamentally different from a mainland evacuation. Here's something worth mentioning about how this weekend's response actually drew on lessons from Hawaii's own recent history. The Big Island has spent recent years managing volcanic activity from Kilauea alongside its normal hurricane season preparedness, meaning county emergency management teams there have genuinely more recent, practical experience coordinating rapid, large-scale evacuations and shelter operations. That existing infrastructure and institutional knowledge, shelters already identified and stocked, evacuation zones already mapped, likely played a meaningful role. So look at how quickly officials were able to open shelters, mobilize search and rescue teams, and communicate specific, actionable guidance to residents. It's also worth mentioning the school and public facility closures that took effect ahead of the storm, since they reflect just how broadly officials treated this threat. Schools and state education offices closed across Hawaii Island, Maui, Lanai, and Molokai for the weekend, alongside beaches, parks, landfills, and transfer stations. That kind of coordinated multi-island shutdown reflects the genuinely comprehensive nature of the preparation effort underway well before the storm's closest approach. It's worth understanding exactly what particularly dangerous situation means as an official designation, since the National Weather Service doesn't attach that specific label casually. It's reserved for the small subset of flash flood emergencies where forecasters have extremely high confidence that conditions will produce a genuine immediate threat to human life. That designation carries real weight precisely because officials use it so rarely, reserving it for moments exactly like Saturday evening in Naalehu, when 3 to 5 inches of rain per hour was actively falling on already saturated volcanic slopes. If tracking real storm science and the actual forecasting behind it interests you, subscribing costs nothing, and it means you'll be here as this pattern keeps developing across the Pacific. Let's talk about why this storm's intensity actually built as it approached the Big Island specifically, because the island's own terrain played a direct role. As Lala's outer bands interacted with the Big Island's volcanic slopes, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa both rising well over 13,000 feet. Moisture-loaded air got forced rapidly upward, wringing out rain at rates far beyond what flat terrain produces. That's precisely why the highest elevations recorded over 30 inches of rain, while lower coastal areas, genuinely dangerous in their own right, saw meaningfully less. Here's how that same mechanism connects directly to the flash flooding that swept away 2 homes in Naalehu. When rain falls at 3 to 5 inches an hour, the rate the National Weather Service recorded during the worst of Saturday's storm, steep volcanic terrain doesn't absorb it, it channels it. Water racing down those slopes concentrates rapidly into narrow stream valleys and gulches, turning what looks like a dry gulch in the morning into a wall of moving water within minutes. That's exactly why the National Weather Service specifically labeled this a particularly dangerous situation for the Cow District. The same enhanced warning tier we've covered on this channel before, the one reserved specifically for the rarest, most severe flash flood scenarios. Let's talk about why a Category 1 hurricane, the weakest classification on the entire scale, was still capable of knocking out power to 70% of an island. Hawaii's electrical infrastructure, especially across the Big Island's more rural stretches, relies heavily on above-ground power lines running through dense tropical vegetation. Sustained tropical storm force winds, let alone hurricane force gusts reaching 80 miles an hour, are more than enough to bring down trees and lines across an entire island simultaneously, especially when those winds persist for hours rather than minutes. Here's a genuinely important number worth understanding on its own terms. Category 1 is the lowest tier on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, covering sustained winds from 74 to 95 miles an hour. It's the category most often described in casual conversation as not that bad. Category 5 storms with winds above 157 miles an hour get the dramatic headlines. But a Category 1 hurricane still produces enough sustained force to snap power lines, uproot trees, and generate genuinely life-threatening flash flooding when interacting with steep terrain. The category number describes wind speed alone. It says nothing about a storm's rainfall potential, which is exactly why Lala caused this much damage, despite sitting at the bottom of the scale. Let's talk about the search and rescue operation specifically, since it represents a genuinely separate emergency response happening alongside the flood damage itself. Hawaii County Mayor Kimo Alameda said several occupied homes may have been swept off their foundations in the Naalehu and Waiheno areas, prompting civil defense to initiate an active search and rescue mission overnight. Separately, in Honolulu, Mayor Rick Blangiardi confirmed crews were working in dangerous conditions at Oahu's Lulumahu Falls Trail searching for a stranded hiker, while the city's Ocean Safety Department reported 59 rescues in a single day as dangerous surf and rip currents battered the coastline, a stark reminder that this storm's hazards extended well beyond the Big Island's direct path. Let's talk about the difference between a hurricane warning and a tropical storm warning, since both were active simultaneously across different Hawaiian islands. And understanding that distinction explains why residents on different islands were told to prepare for genuinely different levels of danger. A hurricane warning, in effect for the Big Island specifically, means sustained winds of 74 miles an hour or higher were expected within 36 hours. A tropical storm warning, covering Maui County, Oahu, and Kauai County, means winds between 39 and 73 miles an hour were expected. That's exactly why the Big Island absorbed the most severe direct impacts, while the remaining islands braced for a somewhat less intense version of the storm. Let's talk about hurricane-force wind gusts specifically, since 3 separate counties, Hawaii, Honolulu, and Maui, all reported them simultaneously, despite the storm's center staying well offshore of any of them. That's a genuine reminder of just how large a hurricane's wind field actually extends. Tropical storm force winds from Lala extended outward up to 205 miles from the center at points during this event, meaning islands separated by dozens of miles can all experience genuinely dangerous conditions at the exact same time, without being in the direct path. Now let's talk about the rip current danger specifically, since it's genuinely one of the most underappreciated hazards connected to a storm like this one. Rip currents form when water pushed toward shore by large, storm-generated waves needs to funnel back out to sea, creating narrow, fast-moving channels. Hawaii's Ocean Safety Department specifically warned residents against entering the water at all this weekend, not because the surf necessarily looked dangerous, but because storm-generated rip currents are notoriously difficult to spot from shore, precisely why it simply wasn't a day to come to the beach. Let's talk about mudslide risk specifically, since it was flagged alongside flash flooding as a primary hazard across areas with steep terrain. When intense rainfall saturates soil on a steep volcanic slope faster than it can drain, the added weight can cause sections of hillside to give way suddenly. That's a fundamentally different danger than flash flooding, since mudslides can occur on slopes with no obvious waterway nearby at all. Simply wherever saturated ground loses structural integrity, which is exactly why officials extended mudslide warnings across a broader footprint. Let's talk about storm surge for a moment, since it's a coastal hazard that operates completely independently from rainfall or wind damage. Storm surge happens when a hurricane's low pressure and powerful onshore winds physically push ocean water higher than normal tide levels. Forecasters had warned Lala could produce storm surge as high as 3 feet along parts of the coast, combined with large, dangerous waves, meaning coastal residents face 2 distinct water-related dangers arriving from opposite directions at the same time. Let's talk about power restoration for a moment. Since 126,000 customers losing electricity represents a genuinely massive repair effort ahead, restoring power typically requires crews to physically assess damage across the entire grid, clearing downed trees and debris from roads, a process that historically takes days rather than hours, especially across an island where reinforcement crews can't simply drive in from a neighboring state. Stay tuned as we continue to track the recovery and the next developments across the Pacific. Stay safe out there. Let's talk about the historical context, because this is the update to a story we've been tracking on this channel, and the numbers here are genuinely significant. Hawaii has not seen a hurricane make direct landfall since Hurricane Iniki struck Kauai in 1992, a Category 4 storm that remains the costliest in Hawaiian history. That 34-year streak technically continues. Lala didn't break it, but it's worth being precise about what that streak actually means in practice. A technicality about the storm's exact center crossing land didn't spare anyone from the consequences. Here's a detail worth knowing for context. A Category 3 hurricane struck the northeast corner of the Big Island back in 1871, according to research from a University of Hawaii atmospheric scientist. Set that aside, and Lala's close pass this weekend represents one of the most direct hurricane threats the Big Island has faced in the modern record. NWS meteorologist Vanessa Almanza described the forecast track as striking very close to the southern tip of the Big Island. It's worth remembering how this storm was expected to behave just a few days before it arrived, because the forecast held up with real precision. The National Hurricane Center had it at a 90% chance of becoming a named storm, on a track that put the Big Island directly in its path. The storm, organized on schedule, reached hurricane intensity and produced the kind of heavy rainfall and flash flooding risk that had been specifically flagged. Here's something worth sitting with if you have family or friends across the islands. The center of this storm passed roughly 30 miles from the coast. For comparison, that's a genuinely short distance, closer than many people's daily commute on the mainland. If you know anyone in Kau District, Maui, Oahu, or Kauai, this is a genuinely good moment to check in directly rather than assume it's past. After weakening to a tropical storm Sunday, the forecast called for some re-strengthening by late Monday as the system continues moving west. It's worth explaining how meteorologists track a storm's distance with this level of precision. Modern tracking combines satellite imagery with reconnaissance data. Scatterometer satellites measure surface wind speeds by reading how wind roughens the sea surface. This lets the NHC pinpoint a storm center. Lala genuinely isn't the first storm to threaten the islands this closely without landfalling. Hurricane Lane brought a foot of rain back in 2018. Meteorologists like Vanessa Almanza emphasize that the landfall distinction matters far less to residents than the lived impact of wind, rain, and flooding. Rapid intensification near the islands is less common than in the open Pacific. Central Pacific waters can run cooler than those that fuel major hurricanes. Lala's ability to organize into a Category 1 near the Big Island suggests temperatures were warm enough to sustain rather than choke off intensification. Early forecasts painted a wider range of outcomes. As the storm approached, that range narrowed, converging on the close pass scenario. Hawaii's isolation in the Pacific shapes how storms reach the islands. These systems typically originate in the eastern Pacific or form locally. That relative geographic isolation is why direct hurricane threats remain rarer than for mainland coastal states, even as this weekend demonstrated the consequences. Meteorologist Brian Norcross emphasized that whether the eye crossed the coastline was a meteorological distinction, not a change in on-the-ground reality. Hurricane Lane in 2018 and now Lala in 2026 mark two close approaches within a decade, a pace in contrast to the previous multi-decade gap. Whether this reflects a shift in storm patterns or ordinary randomness remains a question climate researchers will likely study using this exact storm. I want to be direct about something here, because it would be easy to let a story with this much real damage spiral into something inaccurate. This storm did not make landfall on Hawaii. Every official source, from the National Hurricane Center to the National Weather Service, has been consistent. Hawaii's own governor has been clear about that specific fact. What happened instead was arguably just as important to understand correctly. A hurricane came close enough to cause genuine, serious damage without ever technically crossing the coastline. So here is the honest picture of what happened. A Category 1 hurricane passed roughly 30 miles south of the Big Island, never making landfall, and still knocked out power to 70% of the island. It swept away 2 homes, dropped over 30 inches of rain in the highest elevations, and took 1 life in a storm-related accident. The governor has already started the process toward a major disaster declaration. If there is one sentence to take away from this, let it be this. The difference between a hurricane that technically makes landfall and one that merely passes close by is a meteorological distinction that mattered very little. To the family in Naalehu who lost their home, or to the 70% of the Big Island that spent this weekend without power. Now here is what I actually want to know from you. Based on the forecast for possible re-strengthening by Tuesday, and Lala's track moving south, do you think this system produces any additional significant impacts as it passes Oahu and Kauai, or has the worst of this storm already passed? Drop your prediction in the comments. I will come back to this video once we know how the rest of the track actually played out. If you are anywhere in the Hawaiian Islands right now, please do not rely on this video or any video for live safety information. The National Weather Service Honolulu office and Hawaii's Emergency Management Agency are the official sources for real-time updates as the system continues moving. And if you are in Hawaii and you lived through any part of this storm firsthand, drop a comment with what you actually experienced. Reports from people who were there tell us more than any official statement can, and I read every single one. Like this video if it helped. We will keep tracking this closely as it moves west because a storm forecast to re-strengthen by Tuesday south of Oahu and Kauai isn't finished yet. Subscribe so you do not miss that update. It's worth explaining what happens next in terms of official disaster response since Governor Green's announcement. That process begins with officials conducting preliminary damage assessments, documenting the scope of destroyed homes, infrastructure damage, and financial losses. Once compiled, the governor requests a federal disaster declaration from FEMA, which then reviews before approving assistance for individual households and infrastructure repair. It is worth closing with what genuine preparedness looks like for the remaining islands. Oahu and Kauai residents shouldn't assume the worst has passed. Keeping emergency supplies, water, and backup power sources ready remains relevant for Maui, Oahu, and Kauai residents right now as it was for Big Island. Tropical storm force winds and heavy rainfall were still forecast to spread westward into Sunday and potentially beyond, depending on the system's re-strengthening trend. There is a broader point worth sitting with. The 34-year streak since Iniki's direct landfall can create a misleading sense of safety over time. A hurricane doesn't need to cross that specific technical threshold to take a life, destroy homes, and knock out power across an entire island. The actual risk Hawaii faces was never really about landfall. It was always about how close, how strong, and how much rain. Lala checked every one of those boxes this weekend without ever needing to make that final technical step onto the coastline itself. Hours before reaching hurricane strength, Lala was still a tropical storm. That jump to Category 1 status happened within a narrow window on Saturday. That rapid intensification is why officials urged residents to finish preparations well ahead of arrival, rather than waiting to see how strong it became. Families across the Big Island are beginning the difficult work of recovery, assessing damage, dealing with insurance, and figuring out where to go next. That recovery timeline rarely gets the same coverage as the storm's arrival, even though it represents the actual, lived aftermath for many residents. This story is still developing, and the National Hurricane Center continues issuing updated advisories. We will see you in the next one.